Mr. Frank Moore, he came on board when North Central had some uniquely different challenges. Things were a lot different back then. As I said, Mr. Frank Moore made the decision to retire from our board this year. And Mr. Pat Woods was elected by our board to take his place. And I want you to think about how the times were around here when Mr. Moore came on our board back in 1961. Back then, co-ops and investor-owned utilities were very much in a power grab. North Central was based out of Senatobia, Coldwater, Tate County area. We had taken out REA loans to build lines. We wanted to pick up consumers as quick as we could because the investor-owned utility at the time did not want to serve the rural community. As North Central waited on loan funds, the investor-owned utility made their move and started extending out into the service area and started picking up load. As we waited, North Central lost as many as 1,500 potential consumers. There are a lot of instances where people had a house that was served by MP&L and they built them a barn that could be served by North Central. When that barn got service from North Central, they ran the line from the barn back up to the house, so eventually the house could be served by North Central. The investor-owned utility challenged all these cases. We had some 135 going on at the same time being challenged through the Public Service Commission in Jackson. To fend off all these lawsuits and sitting there and trying to survive while we waited these loan funds, North Central wound up borrowing money from co-ops all throughout the state of Mississippi. Actually borrowed some from Woodruff Co-op over in Arkansas. And then something happened. A company called the First DeSoto Corporation looked to develop anywhere from 3,000 to 6,000 lots in North Mississippi, an area that they would later call South Haven. Well, North Central was uncertain when they would be able to serve that load. And also North Central was concerned that we would not be able to hang on financially long enough to get that load in and start making the revenue that we needed to survive. You got to understand at this time, and you heard all those millions I talked about, the 79, the 80, and the 100 million. At the time, North Central had to have $250,000 a year to survive. We were making $9. So we were headed downhill fast, and then a group of representatives from North Central, including Mr. Eddie Williams, whose son Bobby's on our board, and Mr. R.P. Funderburk, negotiated a swap with the then Mississippi Power and Light Company. The goal was to come up with enough meters to get that $250,000 annual revenue. In 1961, this started taking place. North Central hired a manager, and the board and the manager were not getting along at that time. The board was looking for someone that would cooperate with them. The board decided about this time they would call for their first ever annual meeting to be held in August of 1961. They nominated, they came up with a nominating committee to meet prior to the annual meeting to come up with a slate of people to serve on the board. And I believe Mr. Thompson actually served on that nominating committee back then. The 1961 annual meeting took place in August of 1961 at the Byhalia High School. The minutes reflect that a Mrs. Ford came in a red cowboy hat. She drank 12 free Coca-Colas. And when it came time to vote, had to admit that she was from Red Banks, wasn't a member, and left. We had an election that day, though. And then Miss Dot Smith was one of the election clerks that helped run that election. And it was held and elected from Marshall County that day at North Central's first annual meeting in 1961 were Mr. Frank Moore, Mr. J.P. Woods, and Odell Wilson. The organizational meeting that ensued found Mr. Moore being elected as Secretary-Treasurer, and he was immediately put on a committee to deal with the manager. And he's been dealing with managers ever since. I hope my situation is better because immediately Mr. Moore, after his discussions with the manager, Mr. Moore is with us, the manager chose to resign. There's been a lot of changes since then, though. You can tell where we've come from just trying to stay a viable business that could serve this area. They hired Ray McGee, and we've been through 5 managers since then. With Mr. Moore here, North Central's gone from 3,000 consumers to almost 28,000. The $250,000 annual revenue needed to keep our head above water has grown to over $78 million. And when they signed that check for the monthly power bill to TVA, it was usually around $3,800. Now it averages $5.5 million. We look at where we are now and we see the challenges, but far too often we fail to look back and see the challenges that we face in our early years, because there's a lot to be learned from that. And we certainly appreciate Mr. Moore's insight and leadership through all these years. If you allow